Hello? Are you there? Anybody there? Just me. Tremendous.
Hey. See my headphones? What do I do with them? I'll flip on the light. Oh, here you are.
Hello, everybody. This is James Brown. Welcome. We're going to wait a few moments for our colleagues to join. I see Tracy, you're on. Hope you're enjoying your vacation, and thanks for joining us today.
I am on. Hello, everybody. Welcome from Tucson. It's a little warm here.
Yeah, you might be warmer than where we are. You've ruined my joke.
Oh, sorry. I'll be quiet and wait for the appropriate introductions, but I am here. I will just stay on mute and in the background for the moment while you set us up.
Okay. So we're going to give probably another 3-4 minutes for people to join here. We've got maybe 50 or 60 people who were planning on joining from the STEM Education Coalition and from the Ecosystem. So we're going to give that a little bit of time. Hi, Jerry. Nice to see you. Are you still traveling out west?
Just getting off of mute. Hey, James. Yeah, I'm actually in cool, cold Phoenix, Arizona.
Excellent.
This hot, dry heat thing is just a myth.
Yeah, when it's 120 degrees, it sure is.
It doesn't matter at that temperature, whether it's dry or not. But yeah, I'll be down here for another week or so.
Excellent.
You know, our newest campus is opening up in Austin, Texas. So really eager to hear from that group. Excellent.
Well, hi, everybody. I see we've got a few more people joining. We've got a big sign up for this. So we're going to give a few more minutes for people to join. And I would just ask, if you haven't already muted yourself, please go ahead and mute yourself, because this call is big enough where we will probably have some background if we're not good about that. So the first thing I'll ask, since this is too large of a group to do individual introductions, normally whenever we have a coalition call, we always have time to do that, but this is too big of a group for that. So if you would please just introduce yourself, name, organization, and title in the chat box. If you haven't done that yet, please go ahead and do that so everybody can know who's on here. All right, excellent. I see lots more people coming on. We're just going to give this a couple more minutes. Thanks, everybody, for the introductions. All right, great. Well, it's a couple minutes after the hour. I'm going to go ahead and get started here. Let me just set the stage for a moment with introducing what the purpose of today's meeting is. So this is the first time we've gotten together the members of the STEM Education Coalition, and I'm James Brown. I'm Executive Director of the STEM Education Coalition. We've got about 15 or 20 members of the STEM Education Coalition on the phone here today, and we've also got several dozen representatives of STEM ecosystems. This is the second year we've been in partnership with TIES and the STEM Learning Ecosystem Community of Practice, I think I got that right, to work on technical assistance around policy issues with individual ecosystems. And so over the course of the last year and a half, almost 2 years now, we have partnered with roughly 30 different ecosystems on a wide range of projects, from small one-off events. We've traveled a little bit prior to the pandemic. We've certainly spoken in a lot of virtual events as guest speakers to give previews on policy issues. And we have partnered with a number of ecosystems on a whole life cycle of different legislative and policy issues. And so today, what I wanted to do was give one of our new partners a chance to talk about the history of their project over the last year and a half. So Tracy Mendez of the Austin STEM ecosystem is really, I think, a great example of what you can do in partnership and thoughtfully within this community in a relatively short period of time. So just to set this up a little bit, how we're going to do this is I'm going to give Tracy a few minutes to sort of give you her case story, and we will have some time for questions. and for other comments. And then I'm going to invite any other ecosystems who are on who have kind of similar stories to share. And we've lined up a couple that are already interested to just share little vignettes about what they've done in the hopes that you can learn from what others have done. And you will understand a little bit more about what it is that the STEM Education Coalition can do. And part of what we've learned is that it's really valuable when we can connect individual ecosystems up with both our members across the country and with their colleagues across their states and with other ecosystems from which they could learn. So with that, let me just set this up by saying, one of the early trips we did in this project was actually one of the last trips that I made before the pandemic hit, which was to the San Antonio meeting of the STEM ecosystems in March of 2020. Feels like a really long time ago now. But Tracy was one of the first people who came up to me after the end of that session and said, you know, we'd really like to work together on policy issues. We'd really like to follow up and figure out what we can do. We're kind of new to this space, but we see some opportunities in Texas. You know, we're very well positioned. We're in the state capital. You know, we have a functioning ecosystem that's well established, and you know, we've got all the players in place. But you know, come help us with some policy issues. And so that was the beginning of, you know, honestly, a beautiful friendship. My colleague Austin and I, who works really closely in Texas, is from Texas, oftentimes is confused as being from Austin. You know, Austin and Tracy worked together on this project, which I will let them describe. And so, Tracy, the floor is yours.
All righty. Well, first of all, I come from the business world and I don't miss a good resource when it's presented. So when James got on stage, boy, yes, I was probably the first one in line. So I'm Tracy Mendez, Greater Ulster Ecosystem. Delighted to be here and share the story on behalf of our ecosystem. I would offer you, we are at the very beginning of this story, you know, small victories at best. So there's a lot more to be done, and I'm really looking forward to benefiting from everybody else's commentary about the roads they've been on and more thoughts that you might have for us and lessons learned where you took our path and maybe you stumbled down the road. So let me give you a little bit of background, not any organizational chart, but we are from Texas. We are cowboys. We do things independently. So when the ecosystem came into play, 3 or 4 years ago, it was one of the first cohorts. It was very obvious that there were a huge amount of players in the STEM arena, and nobody was talking to anybody. So the first charter was to connect the dots, and we really connected 2 communities. Community 1 was around the suppliers, if you will, and the other one was around, I'll call it the demand side, or the corporations who wanted the talent ultimately to come out of the STEM group. And so our structure is that we have corporate convenings and we have community convenings, come together 4 times a year, and the 2 groups talk about how to make things go forward. The first couple of years was really more around connecting the dots. Wow, you do this and I do that, and how do we talk better to each other? And that happened on the community side. But on the corporate side, the corporations were eager to put resources against it, especially volunteer resources. But at the end of 2019, having been one of the people that STEM and other nonprofits would come to in the corporate world, I brought our corporate players together and said, what do you need out of us? If you're participating in this group, what can we provide? And their number one requirement was, I need talent and I need a pipeline of talent. And to support that pipeline of talent, we need good PD professional development. Because teachers not only need to teach physics, they need to have some background about what that looks like in the real world and how it's applicable. And I think this is pretty common nomenclature, CTE, you know, career and technology and technical, excuse me. So how do you then provide those kind of resources? So lo and behold, we've been participating, I know I have since I've retired from the business world, 3 years in just about every TIES event. And we would not and could not be here without our friend Jan. And Jan, I saw you on the call, Jan and her leadership and all the benchmarking we could do at TIES. And obviously the introduction then to James and to homegrown Texan Austin Hall, who really has been amazing. So let me give you the background. As we went into this in December, and everybody said in the corporate world, I need a pipeline. As we went into January, the legislative session was starting, and our legislature only meets every 2 years. So we wanted to get very, very focused about what it is we would go and ask them for, if it was policy formal, you know, and some kind of a bill to come out and support us. Now, in the background, we had COVID rolling along, and what became very apparent is that session prior to March, when the party stopped for all of us, was going to be very different. And we had to come up with one thing that we could go after and rally not only our troops, but hopefully a bigger contingency. And for any of you who like business books, I go after the world of The One Thing by Gary Keller. What was the one thing we could do? And I had a laundry list of what we could and should do, but frankly, there were hundreds of education bills. A couple of them spelled the word STEM in them, but most of them didn't. And so what was becoming prevalent was a conversation really in the background that had been going around for years around broadband. There were, and I tell you this background so you can see it's an evolution. You go left, you go right, you meet a new person, and you have to kind of go with the flow. And of course, Austin and James were there to help guide us on these policy conversations. And I would tell you, it was like bringing Texas expression, hot girl to the bar. Every time we were able to start a conversation, to be able to have our friends between James and Austin come and supplement a conversation I was having with a serious player in Texas. It was really strengthened by the kind of knowledge and policy understanding they had to the table. So in Texas, the things that were going on were two different committees. One was called Operational Connectivity, that was around education and broadband. The other one was a several-year-old, the Governor's Broadband Council. Two very different priorities, although it was broadband. Operational Connectivity was all about education, needing broadband, and the rural was about rural Texas, and we have a lot of ground here to cover, needing it. But the two weren't talking. So as I got to meet people, I met the two individual government liaison people who were managing both of those committees. One was around the Computer Association, and the other one was Connected Nation, which many of you know. And so the three of us got talking, saying they're going to come out with different recommendations, and we need to coordinate those efforts. In the background, Austin was also giving counsel to me that we needed to go to the legislature and say, do you understand the importance of broadband at this point in time? Because again, it was the one thing everybody could rally around. Broadband, as you can imagine, covers telecommunication, education, public safety, economic development in the rural world. And frankly, everybody got on that train. There were other groups that I got a chance to get in front of and brought them to the table. So there was a group called DECA, Digital Empowerment Community Austin. And so all the key players in urban Texas, the urban Austin came together, the city, the housing community, the United Way, the school system, et cetera. And they brought an interesting point to the table that said, it's not just about education and rural. Right here in Austin, we have gaps where we don't have broadband networks. So the bottom line to this story is there were a lot of players that came together. And then I stumbled on a group, and I hope most of you, and if you don't, you should see if there's some kind of rendition. I came across a group called Texas 2036. And they truly embodied everything they thought Texas needed to be. And I'm sure every state has this kind of association or group in play. And it was led by two very powerful Texans, Tom Luce and Margaret Spelling. Some of you may recognize those names. They actually were the secretary and assistant secretary to the Department of Education under President Bush. So they had come home, and we got aligned with them, and they were starting to pressure our leadership for a House bill. Ultimately, the House, not the Senate bill, went forward, called House Bill 5. House Bill 5 was pretty simplistic. Texas, again, back to our cowboy nature, had never put in place a broadband office nor a broadband strategic plan. One of, I believe, 6 states in the nation who had not done that. And so the first thing we needed to do is to get that to play through. Because of the players that we had continued to meet through the Greater Austin STEM ecosystem, Texas 2036 asked us to take to all our players an endorsement of everybody's logo that says to the governor and to leadership here, House Bill 5 is absolutely critical. This needs to happen. Good news is all those players came to the table. And again, I'd be a fool to think that it was us and only us that made this happen. But every single pressure point in our educational, rural community, urban community was all about having this happen. It became one of the governor's top 5 priorities, which was exciting to see. We continued that pressure point, and I say this just for one additional critical piece. It wasn't in getting House Bill 5, but it is how it's going to be executed. There was a lot of talk about where it should land. It landed in the controller's office, which we had a second whole round of endorsement because we thought the long-term execution could be much more successful. So I'll stop there with the story to say a lot evolved. That's what came out of it short term. We know the fat lady has barely sung. She's uttered her first note. There's a lot that needs to happen. And now the STEM community is looking at ESSER 3, which is where we have some flexibility in trying to see dollars being used against STEM. So ours is a strategic plan that we won't lose sight of House Bill 5 and what that needs to accomplish, but how we continue to go forward. I would say, as I kind of close up on this, our pivot that we have now, if broadband was that first thing that we needed to get accomplished, our pivot at this point in time is to make sure that we get a collective voice speaking about how STEM has great impact on economic development. Texas is growing by leaps and bounds, second largest behind California at this point in time. We've had the semiconductor business for quite a while, but the Teslas of the world, Amazon's putting in not that big second headquarter, but a pretty big location. We need, and my call to action is, we need to actually home grow our own talent. It is an economic development conversation. It is not an underrepresented community conversation. And I only say that because people give a pleasant head nod to underrepresented communities, and sometimes that doesn't get the funding, the traction, the attention it needs to. It is hard pressed for anybody not to come around the economic development conversation. So I'm going to hand off to Austin, because if my commentary and my soundbite that I'm talking to as we get our corporations to the table and the rest of our groups that I've mentioned before, discuss the next leg to getting STEM visible and prominent and spending the monies that are coming accordingly. If my soundbite is homegrown talent, then Austin Hall, and Austin's going to pick up here, STEM soundbite, excuse me, is STEM is no longer a luxury, it is a necessity. And we kind of think between those two, if we can rally the troops, get a elevated, impactful elevator speech for all of us to be talking the same track, we can now start pacing ourselves for the next piece of this journey. So I thank you for your time and love to hear the rest of the stories. And Austin, hand off to you and your smiling face.
Yeah, thank you so much, Tracy, and thanks for providing all that background. I think it's important to note that a lot of this just started by simply engaging. Tracy took the initiative to engage James and I, and it was through there where we really just fostered continued conversation to really strategize, okay, how do we first just get in the space of advocacy at the state level? How do we grow our partners? Because we know, especially in Texas where it's so large, you really can't make a splash by yourself. You have to have partners to advocate on behalf of education, workforce development, broadband. You have to have partners to do it with you. And that's pretty much true everywhere else. And so that's how we really got started on this. And I think kind of to Tracy's final point that I will build on and try to keep it short here so we can really have a conversation. What we learned throughout this process is that by having those partners just focused on broadband, we've made many new friends that we can now focus on STEM education and the K through 12 level, higher education, workforce development, and beyond. And so now, as you know, the legislative session wraps up, and there's obviously some crazy things happening in this special session. I think several of my Texas Democratic colleagues are spending some time with us here in Washington for the next month, which is a little bit crazy down there for a minute. But what we're now focusing on is rallying our community around this idea that STEM education can no longer be seen as a luxury. It has to be seen as a necessity. The pandemic underscored this and it exacerbated it. And so that's our focus going forward. And by doing all this work that we did on broadband, we have the partners to kind of help lead that conversation. We're starting to get involved with the Chamber of Commerce, this group, Texas 2036, which has many of our friends in the corporate world part of it. They're going to be valuable partners for this. So go ahead, James.
So a couple housekeeping items. So I see a few people are not muted. If you're not speaking, please mute your screens there for us. And secondly, Austin, let me ask you a question to just kind of start this off. So, in my mind, one of the key aspects of this was when the ecosystems interacted for the first time with Texas 2036 and sort of, they're a group that STEM was one of many, many things they were focused on as an agenda item. Talk a little bit about, and Tracy, this is a question for you too, talk a little bit about what you saw the ecosystems in Texas, because you were not just one ecosystem here, you were using some of the other STEM ecosystems in Texas, sometimes speaking as the whole state, sometimes just as Austin. But what did you bring to the interaction with Texas 2036? Why were they interested in working with you, and why did they see this as being valuable for them?
So I'll kick that off and say, from my sales career, I have learned you just continue to softly reach out and touch people. And so always everywhere, always connecting, always asking for the opportunity. And probably the most important part is being able to leverage the resources, James, you and Austin bring to the table, because the credibility is 5x when you can talk about policy in STEM and broadband across the nation. When it comes to, you're right, we were in Austin. Austin is the state capital, but we have partners, and I was remiss trying to make sure I didn't take up too much time. We have already started to build our Ecosphere. For those of you who've heard Jan speak about an Ecosphere, which is taking all of the ecosystems in either a geographic area or in a state and starting to get that conversation a little more connected. So in Texas, we have Alamo. And we also have, and I believe she's on the phone with us listening in to the Texas ecosystem, which is actually out of TEA, which is the Texas Educational Agency. Fair enough, they're, a governmental arm, but we, and so they have particular parameters and charters that they stay within. But that was a broad conversation that says we're all very aligned. I did not go forward as Greater Austin. We went forward as the STEM ecosystems in the state of Texas. So Austin, what is your particular thoughts and comments on that? An embellishment?
Yeah, and I think we had the benefit of Texas 2036 being a relatively new group. But one thing I think that they really, did as a valuable partner that I think we recognized, and perhaps why the relationship worked out, is that they were, very open to involving, a broad range of stakeholders. Their entire vision is how do we get the most stakeholders around our collective vision of making Texas, of making all Texans prepared academically in the entire workforce system for the future, which is why it's called Texas 2036. They want to be a viable, innovative hub for everything that we believe in by 2036. So I think we were lucky in that aspect. They really needed some more voices in the education space, particularly, but they also needed somebody who knew how to connect the business to the community colleges, to the K through 12 folks, to the after school folks. And that's what, ecosystems are particularly good at. So that's how I would answer that, James.
Well, and Austin, I think it also helped, the way you guys got connected with Texas 2036 was through Texas Instruments, which is one of their founding donors and one of our members. And there's, no better way to get introduced in that conversation than to have, one of your supporting funders say, hey, this is a group that you should work with, right? And that's a formula I think, we have started to apply in some other places where, if you look at our corporate members, almost all of them are going to have some relationship like that in any given state depending on what their footprint is. So I thought that was an important part of
Yeah.
it, because we got on the phone with Margaret Spellings and talked through a strategy, right? And
Right.
she had the gravitas, and we were sort of the ground troops.
Yeah, shout out to Hannah and everybody at TI for that.
Yeah, I wasn't sure if Scott Sedbury was on. I see a Sedbury. I'm not sure which one that is, but we might have somebody on for text and inference if they want to say anything. So we've got some time for some questions here, and then I want to open up the floor to anybody else. We've got a couple other folks who are interested in speaking and telling a little bit about what they've done, but we've got some time for questions here if anybody has questions for Tracy or Austin. Let me see if I just got something in the chat here. So any questions before we move on?
James, this is Natalie Qualcomm. I had a quick question.
Please.
Great. I want to say thanks for sharing your story. I thought that was really compelling, and it sounds like having some strong leadership both at the STEM ecosystem level and with Texas 2026 was really imperative to the success that you all have seen so far. I'm curious if there were what other types of recommendations you would have for folks who are trying to also do similar initiatives in other states. What are some of the takeaways that you would, suggest to us, or some starting points for people who may not have, those strong partners in place, or who are looking to really kind of start at the ground level?
Yeah, I'll take a stab at this to start, and then Tracy, feel free to chime in. I think a lot of our success that we had so far down in Texas was first identifying who's really in power to have that influence in the legislature, and with policymakers, whether it's at TEA or on the school board. But when we went through that identification of who those influencers are, that's kind of how we led ourselves to Texas 2036 and latched ourselves onto them. And that's one thing that I would certainly recommend for everybody who's interested in advocacy is, really trying to do a deep dive and understand who those players are in the state house and the governor's office. And they may not be policymakers. In Texas, they're mostly business people who are not in power, but have all the money to give to folks in power. I mean, that's just blatantly how it works in Texas. So I think going through that process is really important.
I will add, am I off of mute? I think I am. I'll add, I did a lot of research and then obviously the partnership with Austin and James, but you will find back to who's in power and what's evolving, where there's a door that closes, another door opens. The path can be very circuitous is what I would offer to you. And so you have to watch as the opportunities present themselves and be very nimble to move and pivot as to what comes to the table and what bandwagon you can jump on. I would have never guessed it would have been the broadband bandwagon, but it became very apparent. It was the key topic. It was critical as an infrastructure element for ourselves. It got a lot of us at the same table talking. And so that's probably the biggest word of wisdom I would have is do a lot of research, stay and find out who the players are, find out who's got the passion, because you got to have the power and the passion. I would tell you, I don't have the power right now, but I've got the passion to keep on trying to bring the players together and be flexible, as you go through this particular conversation, and stay focused on one win at a time. There might be a broader strategic plan, but we realize we've got to possibly have a step or two forward, and we may have a step backwards. So flexibility.
Well, and Tracy, I think that's an important point too, of the pragmatic aspect of what's gone on here in Texas over the last year is, any given group of ecosystems is not likely to be able to influence policy at the level of the governor's office or the legislature on their own, right? You have your own goals, and so does everybody else that's in a position to influence public policy, and it's interactive, right? Connecting with groups like the Texas 2036 group and the TEA and others that have influence, your agenda adjusts as you figure out where your common ground was, what, what the art of the possible is at any given moment, right? And that, it's not a once through system where you decide, all right, here's our objectives and let's go work on this for 2 years, and we're not going to change our objectives based upon those interactions. It was very, very fluid and very pragmatic. And I think that's another lesson, that's worth taking away from this, is just, it doesn't start with having a perfect plan at the beginning. It starts with figuring out who's the first group you talk to, and who's the first group, the next group after that, and the next group after that, so that you've got relationships building at the same time as you're fleshing out your agenda.
And different people will come to the table at different times. So around the broadband, there was a group of people that came around. And again, as I've said, that party's not over. We got to put an office in place. We got to have a plan. We got to spend the money smartly for the next couple of years. But that group will morph the next time. Some players that came to the table for that probably care less about STEM as we get a lot more granular. The other thing, since we've got a STEM contingency here that's developed really, as Austin and I have been talking to TextPost, which is Texas out of school time, that is a big part of the conversation with the ESSER $3 coming. So why can't we have a conversation that intertwines STEM and out of school time, since it's so critical, rather than two different venues? So that's a conversation that morphs. But I will tell you, again, you all know I've got a business background. Here was the net when COVID hit. And I used this call to action for quite a couple months. Do not let a crisis go to waste. COVID was a crisis that allowed education to come to the forefront. So took it like a dog with a bone in my teeth, and we ran with that one. I don't know what the next crisis will be. I don't want a crisis for the sake of a crisis, but I think that's the other thing. When that window of opportunity opens up, you've got to be ready to hit it and hit it hard. And all the players that that you worked with one time around may morph, and you've got to be prepared for that as well.
Well, and so just a last point to make on this before we go to our next example is, I also think, Tracy, it started with you guys taking advantage of the TA opportunities that we were able to provide through our partnership with Ties, right? That it started with a couple of rather formal calls where we got to know you, but it ended up with, you and Austin and others being on email chains and exchanging information and becoming a team, right? That's how this sort of rolls itself out. It starts with that consult with us, and we can give you guidance on where to start maybe, but it really ends up being something that becomes, less formal and more relational as you go forward. So again, if people are on this call and haven't taken advantage of the TA opportunities, and I see a lot of familiar names now, we've just filled up our July calendar for the rest of the month. We've got another one this afternoon with another partner. So it's nice to see that filling up. The next time you see a message from Alyssa or someone else in the ecosystem world, the learning community, or you see it from us, offering up TA opportunities, this is where it starts. So with this, if there are no more comments or questions for Tracy or Austin, I'm going to change the video a little bit and move our window up to the fine state of Ohio. And I'm going to turn it over to to Thomas Phillips and Heather Sherman of the Ohio STEM Learning Network to talk a little bit about their history and kind of a similar example to this from a different state and a different place.
James, thanks so much, and really appreciate the opportunity. I'm going to turn it right over to Heather. She's the director of Ohio STEM Learning Network and has championed an effort in the state legislature over the last couple of years that it's finally come to fruition and resulted in a line item in the state budget helping to support the network's efforts. So Heather, I'll turn it over to you to tell that success story.
You're on mute there, Heather.
I swear that's my middle name. So sorry. Thank you so much for having us and for giving us an opportunity to celebrate. On July 1st, the governor signed the budget, and in that budget, it contained a $1.5 million allocation to support the work of the Ohio STEM Learning Network. And we're so excited. We have been a public-private partner with the state of Ohio for over a decade. And we started this work and created this network together, but there hasn't been any state funding since about 2014. Battelle has carried the lion's share of the funding for the network during that time, plus, grants that we've received to do work. But finally, we were able to get the state and the governor's office to buy in and really support the vision that we have to expand STEM opportunities to students all across the state. And we're really pleased with the additional capacity that we'll be able to reach more educators, and really think about folks who haven't taken on STEM, right? We see all of the connections to economic and workforce development and all the opportunities for STEM to help make Ohio stronger as a state. And we're really looking forward to creating a rural STEM collaborative, continuing to expand programs like MEEP, which is our manufacturing and engineering externship program for teachers, doing some additional work-based learning, expanding access to our statewide student design challenge. This year, we're asking students to tinker around with the question of infrastructure. So reimagine a system, a space, or a product to make their community more equitable or accessible for everyone. So we believe that by helping teachers create opportunities for students to engage in real world learning, engage in real world problem solving, that we will ultimately help prepare a STEM pipeline for our businesses that will benefit everyone.
So Heather, can I ask a couple of questions? So talk a little bit about what the process was to create the opportunity for some new state funding in Ohio. What was that interaction like?
Well, I think that in the background, we've been working on this for a really long time by delivering on our side of the public-private partnership. So we're written into the Ohio Revised Code to be the technical assistance provider for the state STEM committee. So we have been helping with STEM designations since STEM designations started in 2007, 2008. Every year we pull together people to review STEM designation applications. We conduct site visits, we conduct professional development, and we've been engaging, hundreds of teachers across the state in professional development. And so being able to develop a real strong portfolio of measures of success to say that we are making a difference, we started working with the legislature, just like Tracy was saying, like figure out who the decision makers are and working those relationships. So Battelle, obviously last year with our work with the critical care decontamination system, we've talked to the governor a lot of visibility for the student design challenge that we put on. I mean, we have like 4,000 kids who participate in that every year. And so being able to have a strong portfolio of work and then being able to come up with a solid plan, I think was really important. We're aligned to the state priorities with regard to workforce development, with regard to helping schools implement industry credentials, and really making sure that what we're doing is aligned with the state, and then articulating that we've been able to do that, and an investment in spreading this even further, I think was a signal that the state believes and supports in the work that we do, and believes that we can get the job done.
So it's, you're in a kind of a category where there are a number of ecosystems and STEMX members, and some of the after school networks we work with are in this situation where you're in an active partnership with the governor. You're kind of in a fiscal agent situation, carrying out one or more of the state's programs. And that's the one thing we've learned about the ecosystems is there's so much variation, that there's no one size fits all model for public policy, right? One thing though that I think a number of groups in your category are sort of, what were the sensitivities of being a group that already had a relationship with the state of Ohio, and being involved in that, and how did you approach advocacy maybe differently than you would have if you were an entirely independent entity?
So I think, so you're saying what advice would you have for people who don't have a relationship already?
Well, so what I was getting at was, because you're already in partnership with the state of Ohio, you don't always have full freedom in terms of, talking to the state legislature or engaging in public policy as you would if you were, an out organization, right? You're kind of on the inside because you're already doing projects. And I think, some of you will know where I'm going with this. There's other governors' councils that are part of the coalition that sort of play that same delicate walking of the line, where you may not always be happy with the governor's budget request, or you may not always be happy with what the legislature does, but you're sort of beholden to play nice, if you will, and not be so displeased when things don't go your way, and sort of keeping your powder dry for moments like this one.
Absolutely. But I think, let's say that you don't have favorable situation at the moment. I still think figuring out ways to get in and support. We do a lot of work with the Ohio After School Network, and they don't have a public-private partnership to speak of, and they've still done a great job of building those relationships from the ground up, from city council members to working with the Department of Ed and thinking about the 21st century programs. And then from there, getting the attention of different people in the state legislature. I think that they're building the relationship, and I would recommend that that's a path to continue to just talk and do good work and then tell people about it as much as you can.
So thank you, Heather, and thanks, Thomas, for sharing a little bit about your stories. We've got about 5 or 6 minutes left in our 45 minutes today. Wanted to open up the floor for any questions for any of the people who've spoken, or anybody else who wants to share a little bit of an example of what they've done. And as those of you who are coalition members know, if the silence goes on too long, I'll just start calling on people. So I'll give a few minutes for anybody to offer any further questions or comments.
So, James, one thing I will note, hearing Tracy and then Heather is, I think for the folks in Texas, one thing that we're focusing on as the next step is where Ohio has already gone, which is developing a state STEM plan or a state STEM coordinating body. In Texas, there is a workforce coordinating body statewide, but Texas does not have a state STEM plan. And I think that's going to be the viable vehicle for how the Ohio STEM Learning Network has got involved in the first place. And I think that's going to be our next goal in Texas, and something to learn from Ohio.
Thanks, Austin. So we've got time for just 1 or 2 other comments if anybody has any. So we've got a question here from Laura Puritian, Metro West. That might be in Florida. So here's the question. So what is the most challenging pushback you hear from state policy and legislature, and what are the strategies you employ? So Tracy or Heather, actually, this is a really good concluding question. What was kind of your darkest moment? What was the hardest argument you had somebody say back to you when you pushed forward with a policy request?
I'll take a run at that. I think the biggest objection you don't get is the one that is not vocalized to you. It's the hidden one that you're darting around. At least in Texas, I would offer to you, it is around, nobody can ever say the underserved are not deserving, but that's not where people spend their money. So it's our awareness to try to reframe. It's not about the underserved. It is about economic development. So I don't think, unfortunately, most times people won't give you the real reason. So that's been our experience here.
A really great observation. Heather?
Tracy, I'm with you. We didn't have a lot of vocal opposition. Thankfully, people were pretty supportive. However, you don't always hear from the critics. And I think our biggest strategy was to make sure that we were super clear that this was meant to be for all students. I think that's always been the hardest thing is making sure that people who don't have a super strong STEM identity feel compelled to engage in STEM work. And so being able to talk about it from the workforce development, economic development, human skills lens is really important to make the conversation about STEM more inclusive than it ever has been before.
Heather, I would add to that, something I think that you did successfully was employ data. A lot of data-driven results of the work that we had done, and forecasting how the state's investment could be amplified based on a lot of high-quality data that we collected in the work that we'd already done in the state.
One other brilliant example I saw, and I apologize, it might be Ohio or Idaho. I think Idaho is on the call. And because I'm on vacation, I don't have it physically in front of me. At one of the TIES conferences, I saw a pullout. It was literally a business card size fold out. And it walked through what happened in STEM line item by line item by line item in that particular state. Somebody knows which one I'm talking about, please jump on. It is brilliant. And the reason I bring this up, it's one I've been working on here in Texas to figure out how you take those objections, whether they're hidden or obvious, and walk people through with the data that Heather has put together for Ohio to say, here's where we've come from, here's the problem statement, here's why it's valid, and here are potentially some of the solutions. And the quicker you can make that elevator speech something that's consistent for your ecosystem to hand out and for your bigger system, ecosystem or ecosphere partners to speak to, helps identify, because then eventually you can get pushbacks and figure out if there's a sore spot that people can't rally around and then tackle that specifically. But who did that? Because if you all haven't seen it, it is a brilliant way to rally your call and be very focused with any objections you have.
So it was mentioned in the chat that was an Iowa document, and I think we just have a link to that. It's on their website. It's in the chat if you haven't seen that. Give people a few minutes to look at that before we reach the end of our time. So let me first thank all of our speakers: Tracy, Austin, Heather, Thomas, everybody who contributed to this. You know, this is intended. We've sort of wrestled with this challenge of how do we share good stories on what's happening in these public policy partnerships in lots of different places. We've interacted a lot with the after school community kind of similarly. This is our first chance to get this group together and have some back and forth, and would obviously welcome your feedback on whether you thought this was valuable. So we will send around a little bit of a chance for people to give us some feedback on this. It's something we intend to do in the future, where we get a handful of our coalition members together with some slice of the ecosystems that are interested, and hopefully we will see you again in a couple of months, I think. So again, thank you everyone for your inputs, and I hope you thought this was valuable. It'll be on our YouTube channel if you want to send it around to anyone else. So thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.